Welcome to this short interview series for the forthcoming Virtual Global Roundtable organised by the International Association of Constitutional Law on the topic Democracy 2020, Assessing Constitutional Decay, Breakdown and Renewal Worldwide. It's taking place on the 18th to the 26th of November, 9 webinars across 5 days. My name's Tom Daly. I'm co-organizer of the roundtable alongside Professor Wojciech Sadurski. Now, first in our series, we have Associate Professor Michael Pal, who's from the Faculty of Common Law in the University of Ottawa in Canada. And Michael is going to be speaking in webinar 1 of the series on the 18th of November on the comparative constitutional law and politics of voter suppression. Mike, you're very welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's great to be able to chat with you before the event. And for everybody watching, this is taking place on the 29th of October. And for Mike, it's the 28th of October. So we're straddling time zones here. But all I wanted to do with this interview was in 10 minutes to cover just some quick issues that Mike is going to be talking about in the webinar about voter suppression. So I'm going to start with the first question. So we hear a lot about voter suppression, especially in the context of the US elections. So how do you define voter suppression?
Right. So there's a lot of loose talk about what voter suppression is. Sometimes people want to use it to suggest anything they see in an election campaign that they don't like. So my definition, and I think the most useful way to think about it, is laws or regulations or official acts of the state that reduce access to the ballot box, that deliberately make it harder for people who have the right to vote and are otherwise eligible to be able to cast a ballot. And so sometimes we talk about voter suppression in terms of campaign tactics, right? This party is trying to deter some group from voting, or sometimes voter suppression comes up in the long debate we've now had since President Trump was first elected around foreign interference in elections, especially over social media platforms, and our foreign entities advertising or sending messages to try to discourage certain groups from voting. That is sometimes talked about as voter suppression. I define it more narrowly to be, say, strict voter identification laws, or laws that purge voter registration rolls, or laws that make it simply harder to become eligible to cast a ballot.
Great, thanks so much. Everything's much clearer actually now for me too. And you look at this phenomenon from a comparative perspective. So you're examining how it's an understudied mechanism used to hollow out democratic systems. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, we have an ongoing debate around democratic decay and decline, and your own writings, Tom, being a big part of that debate. And so we know if you're a would-be authoritarian, there are some tools in your toolkit that sort of cross different regime types and areas of the globe. You try to capture the courts. You try to capture the election commission, which is another area that I work in, the electoral management body. If you can control that, you can help direct the outcome of the election. You might try to reduce the independence of the media in a variety of different ways. So voter suppression doesn't exist on its own. It's part of a broader series of tactics. It takes place in long established democracies, but also in newer democracies. And think about it this way. In the previous decades, if you were a would-be authoritarian, you might do some very blunt form of electoral fraud, or intimidating voters at the polling station, or outright violence, right? Or stuffing a ballot box, another classic one, or simply banning the other party or opposition leader from running in the next election. Okay? Those would now rightly be accompanied by international condemnation from other countries, international organizations, and probably domestic protest. So if you're a would-be authoritarian and you want to avoid the costs of managing the election such that you're very likely to win, but you'd still like to achieve that outcome, voter suppression looks like an attractive tactic. So you're not ending elections, you're not banning political parties, but you are making it harder to vote. So the classic example is a very strict voter ID rule, okay? And it turns out the poor are much less likely to have photographic IDs that also show their address. So it's harder to prove who you are and where you live, okay? And there's specifics in different countries, but as a general matter, that's often the case with voter ID rules. And so if you implement a facially neutral law, it doesn't say that the poor should not be allowed to vote, doesn't say people in a certain region should not be allowed to vote or a certain racial or ethnic group, but it might have that effect, right? And so you don't have the international condemnation of deliberately attacking one of those groups. You don't have the domestic protest potentially. So it's a more subtle and sometimes more hidden way of achieving some of those autocratic ends. So it's sort of that pushes a regime sometimes between a real democracy or liberal democracy towards electoral or competitive authoritarianism. Constitutional courts after World War II, again, you've done lots of work in this area, are pretty good at spotting and recognizing the harm in an outright ban on a group of people from voting, okay? What would a court say if the government's law said, we are banning this group from voting, they are not worthy, okay? It would be condemned, there would be protests, okay, domestically, internationally. Voter suppression is harder for courts to understand, right? It's harder for them to pinpoint the harm because no one's actually prevented from voting outright. It's just simply the cost on the voter to, say, purchase the ID or to go across town to the polling station that's been moved from the more convenient location closer to them. It just makes it less likely they're going to cast a ballot and therefore increases the probability that the incumbent is going to win. So it's a new form of subtle manipulation of electoral democracy that is favored by many who don't want to pay the costs of using some of those older, more nefarious tactics.
So part of this global trend, another dimension of this trend towards that subtler hollowing out rather than full frontal assaults. So thinking about long established democracies and looking to the US elections happening right now, I mean, how bad is voter suppression in the US?
Right. Well, it's October 28th where I am, and I saw a prominent journalist today, Andrew Sullivan, tweeted, voter suppression can't be true because look, turnout's going up because all the numbers are showing there's a lot more early voting in the US. I don't think that holds. Okay, voter suppression doesn't prevent people from voting, it makes it harder. And so you see a lot of enthusiasm potentially in this race. You'd assume that's usually negative for the incumbent, President Trump, right? If you see a lot of that kind of enthusiasm. So it's not clear yet. I mean, it's clear that voter suppression is a problem in the US. It's not clear quite how bad it is, okay? But the US has a very long and inglorious history of voter suppression. Poll taxes, right? You have to pay your taxes or a certain kind of tax in order to cast a ballot, obviously deters certain groups from voting. Literacy tests. And one of the fun things I do with my students is occasionally like let them see one of these literacy tests from, say, Alabama, that were designed that no one would actually be able to pass them, right? So these were ways of voter suppression, weeding people out so they couldn't actually cast a ballot even if they had a right to. The Voting Rights Act didn't solve everything and perfect American democracy, but it really made electoral competition a reality in many of the states because the states that control election administration in the US. And so there was a case, Shelby County v. Holder, where the US Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. So no longer do the jurisdictions with a long history of racist actions like poll taxes and literacy tests have to pre-clear changes to their election laws with either a court or the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. So what that did was open the floodgates to states in implementing a whole host of new discriminatory laws, of very strict voter ID rules that clearly seem favored to help some groups rather than others. So your hunting license is an acceptable form of ID at the polls, but not your student identification. Okay, it's not hard to see which groups that may favor. And so there was another case that went up to the Supreme Court called Crawford, where an Indiana voter ID law constitutionality was challenged. The U.S. Supreme Court said the voter ID law was fine from the point of view of the Constitution. But since then, and since that Shelby case, the rules have become much more restrictive, much stricter. The voter suppression is much more blatant. And so Texas, North Carolina, Wisconsin have been, North Carolina to a certain extent, have been particularly egregious, right, in the last number of years since the Shelby case. They are also states that might matter in the outcome of the election in 2020, Wisconsin and North Carolina in particular. So from my point of view, the voter suppression is quite serious. We won't know quite how extensive it is until probably after the election. But the U.S. Supreme Court is hearing cases, it seems like almost every day, is coming out with some new decision related to mail-in voting and when mail-in ballots can be received. And so or how many drop boxes for mail-in ballots there will be per county in Texas. So the Texas recently reduced the number of mail drop boxes. Not an issue we ever talked about in the past, but if you have fewer areas to drop your mail-in vote, it's harder to cast a ballot. So those are the issues that are very live in the US. It's a serious problem. We probably won't know quite how serious it is until after November 3rd.
Thank you so much, Mike. And, of course, as you say as well, this happens far beyond the US. So sort of looking to the future, what are ways we can address this issue, both in the US and elsewhere?
Right. I mean, the US Constitution is quite old, right, in many respects. So almost any newer constitution will have a explicit constitutionally guaranteed right to vote in it. So that's one step that's already been taken in most places. That alone doesn't stop voter suppression because a government that wants to suppress votes will go to court and they won't say we're doing this to suppress votes, implementing this strict voter ID rule or purging the voter registration rules. They'll say we're doing it to prevent fraud. And we have no evidence of fraud is usually the case, but we're doing it to prevent the abstract harm of fraud. And fraud is bad in an election, right? But the medicine they're selling is much worse than the actual problem, or the cure they're selling is much worse than the actual problem. So one way that constitutional designers have tried to address this is by being very specific in the constitutional text. So it's not simply a right to vote, it's a right to vote, but also a right to be registered or a right to have access to a polling station. So being much more granular, and what that does is it takes discretion away from judges to make trade-offs, right? To say, oh, this is worth it, even if it deters people from voting because of the abstract fear of electoral fraud or something like that. So being more granular in the design of the Constitution and the democratic rights is one option. Another option is actually what the US did, right? The Voting Rights Act worked quite well from 1965 until 2013. So it wasn't perfect. Which areas of the US should it apply to? Which should it not apply to? Do you have to prove intent? Do you not have to prove intent? There's all sorts of live issues there. But the idea that in areas where it's suspect to make changes, that there should be some kind of oversight mechanism, that is quite a useful solution for other democracies, because otherwise you get into a vicious circle where a state implements a restrictive, say, voter ID rule. It's in place for the election, gets struck down as unconstitutional after the election, but it's already done its dirty work. So some kind of Voting Rights Act is another kind of solution that other jurisdictions should look at.
So lawyers can help. Mike, thank you so much for such an interesting interview. I mean, these are short, but this has been extremely informative. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion on the 18th of November, 2 weeks after the US elections, of course. And we'll have a lot to talk about then as well. But for now, thank you very much.